Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 17 on the Texas Executive, or Video 17 on the Texas Executive. This one will be a little shorter than most of them. So I'm going to start just as I did with the Texas legislature with a comparison constitutionally to the U.S. Congress. So the Texas to the U.S. president. Um, so the U.S. Constitution establishes the presidency in Article 2. The Texas Constitution doesn't get to establishing the Texas executive until Article 4. The reason being that Article 1 of the Texas Constitution is the Bill of Rights. So this is a recurring theme that you're going to get one more time when we get to the courts. The most important thing the U.S. Constitution was doing was assigning power to the federal government, because the national government under the under the Articles of Confederation was falling apart because it didn't have enough power. The main thing the Texas Constitution wanted to do after being involved in a revolution against Spain, a revolution against Mexico, and then the Civil War within the United States, was guarantee the rights of its citizens. So there was a difference in Article 1. U.S. Constitution establishes the presidency and then gives the presidential powers of the executive to the president, and in its opening sentence vests the executive power of the United States in the president, and only the president. The Texas Constitution goes a little different direction. It establishes the executive in Article 4, and it does list executive powers in Article 4, but the structure is different. Whereas the structure of the presidency is unitary, there's just one president. The structure of the Texas executive is plural. There are 6 officers listed in Article 4. They each have separate powers, and they're each directly elected by the people. So each of these executive officers gets their power directly from the people. And although there are ranks in office, with a governor as the highest level executive official, these other 5 officials are not appointed by him, hired by him, and can't be fired by him. They work for the people. So the U.S. president is an elected chief executive. The president and vice president are the only elected executive branch officials, and the president is the only one that has any executive branch power. The vice president has one constitutional power, presiding over the Senate, and doesn't have any executive power unless the president dies, resigns, is impeached and convicted, or becomes incapacitated. Originally, the president and vice president were the first place winner and the runner-up in the Electoral College election. Under the original Constitution, the vice president was automatically of the opposite party of the president, because it was the first place winner and the second place person in the presidential election. That didn't work out really well. Certainly, at least it didn't work out as well as they thought it would, and some people didn't like it. So since the 12th Amendment, the president and vice president are elected together as a pair from one party, and you vote for both at the same time. The Texas executive has 6 elected officials. They're all elected on their own right, and they can come from different parties. Since the 1990s, they have all been Republicans. Through the 80s and 90s, there were some Republicans and some Democrats. Prior to that, it was usually all Democrats. Right now, they're all Republicans. And for the foreseeable future, they probably will be. So I'm going to want you to learn the top three, the names of the top three. I'm going to want you to learn the names of the offices for all six. So you don't have to learn the names of the bottom three, but you should learn the names of the top three. So our governor right now is Greg Abbott. The governor is the top executive in the state. Our lieutenant governor is Dan Patrick. Like the president, like the vice president of the United States, the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas is the president of the state senate and wields a lot of power. Dan Patrick, some people right now claim that Dan Patrick is more powerful than Greg Abbott. He controls the Senate legislative agenda and has great influence over the House legislative agenda. The third major office holder is the Attorney General, and this is Ken Paxton. Greg Abbott, Dan Patrick, and Ken Paxton have all been in the national news recently. Dan Patrick less so than the other two, but Ken Paxton has been involved in major federal lawsuits on behalf of the state of Texas, including some that impacted on the 2020 presidential election. Greg Abbott, being the governor of the second largest state in the country by population and landmass, is in federal or in national news a lot. And so there's a chance you may have heard some of these people if you've watched or read any U.S. Political news. The Controller of Public Accounts, it's currently a guy named Glenn Hagar. He's in charge of financial matters. He's the chief financial person for the Texas executive branch. The Commissioner of the General Land Office is Dawn Buckingham, MD. An interesting thing to know about her is that she is a Republican. She won this office by running against the Republican who held it last in the primary election. And that that gentleman was George P. Bush. George P. Bush is the son of former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. He is the nephew of former Texas Governor and former President of the United States, George W. Bush. He's the grandson of former President of the United States, George H. W. Bush, and he's the great-grandson of former U.S. Senator from, I believe, Connecticut, Prescott Bush, which is what the P stands for, is Prescott. So he came from a very powerful, very well-established Republican political family. He got in some conflict with some really conservative Texas Republicans over a few things, and he ended up losing his office in the Texas Republican primary. Statewide in Texas right now, it's the Republican primary that decides who holds office. And so Dawn Buckingham won that primary, and then she won the general. You don't have to remember her name, but one of the offices is the Commissioner of the General Land Office. And last, the Commissioner of Agriculture. This is a guy named Sid Miller. And if you can imagine what a Texas Commissioner of Agriculture might look like, that's what Sid Miller looks like. If you can imagine your stereotypical Texan, that's Sid Miller. And I don't mean it in a bad way. He's an interesting Texas character. I don't agree with him on everything. I don't disagree with him on everything either. But he is an interesting Texas character. So that's our main plural executive, and these are all directly elected by the people. So Greg Abbott can't just call Ken Paxton on the phone and command him to file or drop a lawsuit. If he called Ken Paxton on the phone, I think they probably get along pretty well, and Ken Paxton would probably say something like, I'll try to get that done. But he can't just order him to do it, because they answer directly to the people. Um, there are some non-Article 4 officials. So these are people that are part of the Texas plural elective, but they're plural executive. They're also elected directly by the people, but they don't come out of that Article 4. One is the Railroad Commission. The Railroad Commission consists of Christy Craddock, who's the chair, and I do want you to remember her name, Ryan Sitton, and Wayne Christian. Why do I want you to remember the name of the chair of the Railroad Commission? Well, the Railroad Commission doesn't regulate railroads. The Railroad Commission regulates the oil and gas industry in Texas. And Texas, if it were its own country, would be the fourth largest producer in oil and gas in the world. The United States currently produces 12.9 million barrels per day. Russia produces 10.3 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia produces 9.5 million barrels per day. Texas produces 5.8 million barrels per day, and Canada produces 5.6 million barrels per day. If Texas was its own country, United States would drop to third, Russia would be first, Saudi Arabia second, U.S. third, and Texas would still be fourth. So, Christy Craddock is a female elected official here in Texas who is in charge of the industry that produces the fourth largest amount of any country in the world if it was its own country. I argue regularly that Christy Craddock is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, female elected official in the world right now. She's in charge of an industry that is worth hundreds of millions of dollars a day and hundreds of billions of dollars a year. There are countries that are smaller than the than the Texas oil industry. And the Texas oil industry is nearly half of the U.S. oil industry. And it's more than Canada's, which is a major oil producer. So no authority over railroads. The Railroad Commission has not one thing to do with railroads. It regulates the oil and gas industry. It regulates coal mines, but I don't think we actually have any operating coal mines anymore. It regulates uranium mines. The uranium mines are shut down, though, although the Railroad Commission is still in charge of them, which mostly means there are environmental things to take care of. The second major group that I want you to know about, and all you really need to know about, is that they exist and have 15 members. State Board of Education, it holds executive power. It also holds some legislative power because it makes rules for the schools. So it's a little bit of both. But I rank it, and I'm not the only one who considers it as a if not part of the direct plural executive from Article 4, at least an example of the splitting up of executive power. So one thing to know before I go through this list again is while the U.S. government takes separation of powers to the degree of having Congress, the executive under the president, and the courts, and then splits Congress into the Senate and the House, in Texas, we have the legislature, the executive, and the courts, and we have the Senate and the House, further separation of powers in the legislature, but we really take separation of powers seriously here. We separate the executive as well. Separation of powers even to another level. The second thing I want to say about this is Texas is not unique in this. Many U.S. states also have a plural executive. They may not have as many elected executive offices. Some of them may have more. This degree is about what I'm familiar with in the states I am most familiar with, this is pretty typical, having 5 or 6 statewide elected executive officials. Um, the exact jobs vary. Governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general being elected officials is pretty typical for the states I'm familiar with. Again, know all 6 of these offices, just have to know them. And then for the top 3, you need to know the names of them. Now you may have some other, so those are going to be for the questions I'm going to ask you from lecture. You may need to know a little bit more from the book, so be sure you do this section of the homework. But as far as from the lecture, I can tell you that I'm going to ask you who the governor is, I'm going to ask you who the lieutenant governor is, I'm going to ask you who the attorney general is, and I'm going to ask you something about Christy Craddock, and something about what the Railroad Commission does. So you need to know those things. Thank you for listening, and the next video I put out should be the ethics of the executive.